This week's readings focus on the concept of environmental justice. So we see this idea being discussed by Schneiderman in her 1997 article. And she discusses how many of our global environmental problems have dire consequences for everyone, but they're especially problematic for poor people, women, and children, particularly in developing countries. And so this is an argument that combines eco-criticism and feminism as a way to bring attention to the fact that already marginalized groups of people are going to be experiencing these environmental consequences at a greater rate. This is something we've seen Harriet A. Washington already make an argument for, particularly about people of color in the United States, as well as impoverished groups of people, as well as families of young people without a lot of social economic mobility. And so in the second part of the book, Washington discusses things like lead and prenatal exposures and gives a lot of concrete evidence for how, particularly in America, these marginalized groups of people are impacted and how this has long-term consequences for their development, for their IQ, and also for the general well-being of the United States. So if we go back to just the title of the book, that centers this argument in a way where Harriet A. Washington is saying a terrible thing to waste. And so through our environmental degradation, that's causing the loss of IQ points, that's causing behavioral problems, that's literally damaging the brains of our citizens. What are we potentially losing? Besides the morality of the harm that we're doing, we're also potentially losing brilliant minds. We're causing more harm because things like lead are correlated with criminality and impulsivity. And so we are creating social problems through environmental degradation. So this is a really specific type of environmental argument because a lot of what we've discussed and read talks about environment and nature as almost an inherent good that needs to be preserved, something to take part in, something to sense, something to appreciate in terms of sense of place. That idea of Grunwald's reinhabitation into the natural world. And so that is another important piece of environmental literature. This specific eco-critical piece of environmental literature is looking at what is our environmental damage doing to ourselves? How is environmental damage connected to human damage? And part of this issue that Harriet A. Washington traces is, how did we get to this place? Politically, socially, how did we get to this place? And so she discusses, while a failure of policy and a failure of regulation is certainly a major factor to blame, there's also a rhetorical component. And she says, by the 1970s, a powerful discourse of personal responsibility for health and disease placed blame on individuals and implicitly absolved corporations that marketed harmful products such as cigarettes and lead paint and polluted the nation's water and air. So there's this idea, well, if you live in the slums, you have to expect a level of environmental degradation that's going to be harmful for you. It's your fault that you lived in this factory. It's your fault that you lived in impoverished Flint, Michigan, that had tainted drinking water. If you would have worked harder or been more knowledgeable and moved your family into a safer place, this wouldn't have happened. So not only does it place the blame on the individual, and it requires an incredible amount of responsibility and literacy on the part of the individual to even know this is happening, it also absolves the corporations, because the corporations can continue what they're doing, saying that it's up to the individual essentially to make better choices to avoid us. And we see this in other things in the United States, such as our food systems, but also, of course, the environmental degradation of our planet. So we will continue to see how Harriet A. Washington gives really practical examples from the perspective of a scientist of how the environmental degradation is impacting the human brain, and how it is impacting our society and, in general, our social well-being.